The woman knocked at the wrong time of year for knocking at strangers' doors. October in the Wyoming high country was no season for asking favors, and the man who opened the door that evening had been standing at his stove in the particular way of someone who had long since given up expecting company. He was tall, square-shouldered, with a beard that wanted trimming and hands that showed 40 years of hard use. His name was Gideon Warr, and he had lived alone on this piece of ground outside Calder's Fork for 11 years, and he had made a private arrangement with solitude that suited him well enough. The woman on his porch was not what he expected. She was somewhere past 30, with dark eyes that had gone steady in the way eyes go steady when they've seen enough that surprise is no longer a luxury. She wore a coat that had been good once, and a wool hat pulled low. Behind her, half hidden in the thin dark, 3 children stood in a row. The oldest was a girl, maybe 10, with her hand on the shoulder of a boy who looked 7 or so. The youngest was pressed against the girl's side, a child of perhaps 4, with a blanket wrapped around her that trailed in the dirt. The woman said, "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking to work." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the children. The boy was shivering. The youngest had her face turned into her sister's coat and was not making a sound, which in Gideon's experience was worse than crying. He opened the door wider. "Come in," he said. "If this story is touching your heart, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if a woman in your family came west with nothing and built a home, share her name in the comments." I read everyone. Her name was Cora Blaine. She had come from Sheridan with her children on a wagon that broke an axle 12 miles east of Calder's Fork, and the driver who'd sold her passage had declined to wait while she figured out what came next. The children were Nell, the oldest, who had their mother's steady eyes; Thomas, 7, who had an anger in him that Cora had been watching carefully since his father died 8 months ago; and the youngest was Bess, 4 years old, who had stopped talking much after the funeral and had not fully started again. Gideon learned all of this across the space of 20 minutes, sitting at his own table while Cora fed the children from the pot of beans he had been about to eat alone. She did not tell him the story at once. She offered it in pieces, the way careful people offer things they're not sure will be welcomed, and he received each piece without comment and let the silence between them work the way silence works when 2 people are deciding whether the other could be trusted. He had set 4 plates. She noticed that. He had not asked questions before he did it. He had simply taken down 4 plates and set them at the table and pointed the children toward the bench and gone back to the stove. It was such a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. Thomas ate without speaking and kept his eyes on the table. Nell ate carefully, the way children eat when they're trying to take up as little space as possible. Bess fell asleep with a biscuit still in her hand before her bowl was half empty, and Cora lifted her on her lap and went on eating with one hand. "Where were you headed?" Gideon asked. "Nowhere specific." Cora looked at him over the top of Bess's head. There was a woman in Sheridan who said there was work in Calder's Fork. Laundress work or cook work. She had a cousin who ran a boarding house. Margaret Avery's place. That's the one. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Margaret Avery sold that boarding house in August. Moved to Denver. Something moved through Cora's face, there, and then controlled. "I see." The woman in Sheridan may not have known. She may not have. Cora set down her spoon, shifted Bess's weight. "Then I need to find something else. Tonight." "Not tonight." She met his eyes. "Tonight I'm asking for a floor and a fire. Tomorrow I'll find something else." He let her have the floor by the stove. He gave the children a blanket he had not used in some time and did not comment on the state of their coats, which were a season behind what the weather had turned. He banked the fire and went to his own room and lay in the dark and listened to the sounds a house makes when people are in it who are not you. In the morning, they were still there. This was not a surprise. It was October, and the temperature had dropped overnight, and when Gideon came out at first light, Cora was already at his stove. She had found the oats and the lard tin and was making something that smelled better than anything he had cooked in months. She did not ask permission. She had simply looked at what was there and gone to work. "Sit," she said. He sat. It was his own kitchen. He sat down and let her put food in front of him and experienced the particular strangeness of being cooked for when you have not been cooked for in a very long time. Thomas appeared first, following the smell. He stood in the doorway of the main room with the look of a boy who had been taught recently that the world was not reliably on his side and was waiting to find out what category this morning fell into. Gideon nodded at him. Thomas came in and sat down without speaking. Nell brought Bess, who had slept through the night, wound into the blanket like something hibernating, and who sat at the table with her blanket still around her shoulders and regarded her oats with serious attention. "How much flour do you have?" Cora asked. Gideon looked up. "A 20-pound sack. Half used. Salt pork? Some. Potatoes. Root cellar's got a good supply. I put up more than I'll use before spring." Cora nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they're doing arithmetic in their head. "The children need 3 things," she said. "Warmth, regular food, and something to do that makes them feel useful. The youngest needs quiet and consistency. The boy needs work that matters." She glanced at Thomas without letting him see her do it. "He's carrying something he doesn't know how to put down." Gideon looked at Thomas, who was eating his oats with focused determination, not speaking. "His father, 8 months ago. Fever." A silence. Outside, the wind pushed at the cabin walls with the flat insistence of early-season cold. "What did his father do?" "Farrier. Thomas used to go with him on rounds." Cora looked at her plate. "He's been trying to be the man of the house since March. He's 7 years old." Gideon thought about the mule in his small lean-to barn, which needed its shoes checked before winter proper settled in. He thought about a boy who needed to feel useful. "I've got a mule that needs attention," he said. Thomas looked up. It was the first time he had made eye contact. "Not today," Gideon said. "Weather's wrong. But soon." Thomas looked back at his oats, but something in his shoulders had changed by a fraction. The situation sorted itself out over the following 2 days with the logic of necessity rather than the logic of planning. There was no one place in Calder's Fork that needed a laundress or a cook badly enough to take on a widow and 3 children. Gideon made a trip to town on the 2nd day and came back knowing this, and he sat at the table that evening after the children were asleep and told Cora plainly. "There's nothing," he said. "Not until spring, when Anselm's hotel takes on extra staff. Maybe not even then." Cora had been mending Thomas's coat sleeve with his sewing kit, which she had found and used without asking, and she did not stop mending while she listened. "Then I need to keep looking." "Where?" She did not have an answer. He had known she would not have an answer, which was why he had asked the question, not to be cruel, but to make the shape of the situation visible to both of them at once. "I have a second room," he said. "It's been a storage room for years. It would take a day's work to clear. Roof is sound." He paused. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering an arrangement. You cook and keep the house. I supply the food and the fuel and the floor. The children stay until there's somewhere better." Cora set down the coat. She looked at him with those steady dark eyes. "What?" He thought about how to answer that. He could have said something practical about the convenience of having a cook through the winter. He could have said something vague about neighborly duty. He said instead, because he was a man who had little patience for soft language, because the little one hasn't spoken 3 words since he walked in, and her sister is 10 years old and already working like she's 40, and the boy needs someone to give him something real to do before he turns that anger somewhere it can't be taken back. He looked at the coat on the table. "And because you knew what he needed before you'd been in this house an hour. That tells me something." Cora looked at the coat for a moment. Then she looked up. "I'll take the arrangement," she said. "But I want it clear that this is work. I'm not here as a charity case, and I won't be treated as one." "I've never treated anyone as a charity case in my life," Gideon said. "Then we understand each other." They did. The storage room took most of a day, as he had predicted. Cora worked without being directed, making decisions about what to keep and what to move and how to arrange the small space with the authority of someone who had done this kind of work before and knew that thinking through the organization before you started saved twice the effort later. Nell helped with the smaller boxes. Thomas moved the larger ones, setting his jaw and lifting with his whole body and saying nothing when Gideon quietly moved to the other side of a crate to take half the weight without making a point of it. Bess sat in the corner of the main room with her blanket and watched the door. By afternoon, there were 2 small beds in the room, one for Cora and one for the girls to share, and Thomas would sleep on a cot near the stove as he had been doing, which he had already established as his preference. The room smelled of cedar from the boxes they had moved, and Nell had put the one small decoration Cora had carried in her bag, a paper cutting of flowers, the kind made by folding and cutting, on the windowsill, and the paper flowers caught the afternoon light and threw shadows across the plank floor. Gideon stood in the doorway of the room and looked at it. Cora came to stand beside him. "It's good," she said. "Thank you. It's a storage room." "It's a room," she said. "That's what matters." The town of Calder's Fork had its opinions about this arrangement, as small towns do about anything they didn't organize themselves. Gideon was aware of the opinions the way he was aware of most things, clearly and without particular distress. He had lived outside of what Calder's Fork thought was proper for long enough that their thinking had ceased to cost him anything. He heard about it first from Pete Munn at the feed store, who managed to be both friendly and pointed in the way of men who have had practice at it. "Heard you've got a widow up there," Pete said, not unkindly exactly, but with the tone of a man waiting to see how you handle the implication. "I've got a cook," Gideon said, "and her children. They're staying through winter while she finds work." Pete absorbed this. Martha Spence has been saying it's not appropriate. Martha Spence, Gideon said, has been saying things aren't appropriate since 1869, and the territory has largely survived it. He paid for his grain and left. He did not tell Cora about this conversation. He told her instead that he would need her to make bread for Friday, because he was planning to stop in at the Halverson place on his way back from checking the east fence line, and the Halversons had 6 children and a new baby, and he had a habit of bringing something when he stopped in. Cora looked at him for a moment. He had noticed a way of looking at him when he said something that revealed more than he had intended to say. "You bring them bread regularly," she said. "When I have it. When you make the trip to the east fence line, which is most Fridays, generally." She nodded once and went back to what she was doing. But there was something in her expression that had shifted, a recalibration of the kind he was beginning to recognize in her when she received new information about a person. The bread was good. It was very good. It was the kind of bread that Gideon had eaten once or twice in his life at other people's tables and had thought, vaguely, that bread like that was something that happened to other people in other kinds of lives. He ate a piece while it was still warm, standing at the counter, because he felt obscurely that sitting down to eat it would require him to acknowledge something, and he was not ready to acknowledge it yet. "What did you learn to bake?" he asked. "My grandmother." Cora was slicing the second loaf for the Halversons. She kept house for a German family in St. Louis for 20 years. She learned their way of doing bread, and she said it was the most useful thing she ever acquired. "Your grandmother was from Germany?" "My grandmother was from Mississippi originally. She came north after the war." Cora wrapped the bread in cloth. She was not the kind of woman the world made space for easily. She made her own space. Gideon looked at the wrapped loaf. He thought about the way Cora had walked into his kitchen that first morning and gone to his stove without asking. "I see where you get it," he said. She looked at him. It was not a long look, but it had a quality he could not quite name. Then she handed him the bread for the Halversons and went to find Thomas, who had asked 3 times that week about the mule. The mule's name was Clary, and she was old and bad-tempered and opinionated about who she allowed near her hooves. She had let Gideon touch her feet for 11 years because she had come to believe he would not do anything foolish, but she made newcomers earn it. Thomas spent the better part of 2 mornings simply standing near her with a bit of dried apple in his hand, not pushing, not reaching, just being present in the way his father had presumably taught him that animals required. Gideon watched this from the lean-to entrance without saying anything. On the 3rd morning, Clary lipped the apple from Thomas's palm and did not move away. Thomas's face did something complicated and brief that he immediately put away. He looked at Gideon. Gideon gave him a single nod. That was all that was needed. The front hoof was the worst. The shoe had been shifting for a week, and Gideon had been leaving it, which was not good practice, and Thomas noticed the shift after 10 minutes of looking and said so, which meant the boy had been paying real attention. Gideon showed him the problem and showed him how to hold the hoof and let him watch while the shoe came off, And by the end of that afternoon, Thomas had held a hoof properly for the first time and had not flinched when Clary shifted, and he had talked more in 3 hours than he had in the preceding 2 weeks combined. He talked about his father, not directly and not all at once. He talked about the way his father had said you could read a horse's mood from its ears before anything else. He talked about a mule they had shot in March that had kicked a bucket clean across a stable yard, which Thomas had apparently found genuinely funny even at the time. He talked without looking at Gideon, his eyes on Clary's flank, and Gideon listened and did not offer anything the boy had not asked for. After supper that night, Cora was doing dishes and Thomas was already asleep on his cot. Nell was at the table working on something in a composition book, and Bess was sitting beside the lamp watching the flame with the focused attention she brought to anything that held still long enough. Gideon sat across from Bess. He had a piece of pine he had been meaning to whittle into a peg for a harness repair, and he took out his knife and began. Bess watched his hands. He did not speak to her or look at her directly. He simply worked, turning the wood and taking small, careful shavings, letting the shape come out slowly. After perhaps 10 minutes, she slid off her chair and came around the table and stood at his elbow and watched from a distance of about 6 inches. He kept working. After another 5 minutes, she said, "What is it going to be?" It was the first full sentence she had said in his hearing since the night they arrived. He tilted the piece so she could see the shape that was starting to emerge. "Peg," he said, "for a harness. See how it goes here?" He showed her where it would fit, using his thumb as a placeholder for where the peg would sit. She studied this with the same gravity she brought to the lamp flame. "Could you make something else?" she asked. "What else?" She thought about it for a moment. "A bird," she said. He looked at the piece of pine. It was not ideal for a bird, being fairly straight-grained and not wide enough for wingspan. He looked at his scrap pile in the corner. "Not from this one," he said. "I'll find a better piece tomorrow. A bird needs more wood." Bess considered this. Then she went back to her chair and sat down and went back to watching the lamp. But differently now, the way a person watches something when they have remembered that waiting is not the same as nothing happening. November came in the way November comes at elevation, fast and without apology. The first real snow fell on a Tuesday, a proper fall that lasted 2 days and left 14 inches in the yard and drifted to the eaves on the north side. Gideon and Thomas dug out together, Gideon handling the heavy work and handing Thomas the smaller shovel and showing him which drifts to attack first based on where the path needed to stay clear. Thomas figured out the logic of it within an hour and began to anticipate the next section before being directed. Cora watched from the window, and when they came in she had coffee and cornbread and did not comment on how long they'd been out or how red their hands were. She put the food on the table and let them be cold for a few minutes longer before they warmed up, which was the right instinct, and both of them ate without talking for a while. "South Fence is going to have a down post before Christmas," Thomas said, to no one specifically. "The one by the big pine." It was leaning before the snow. Gideon looked at him. "I noticed it in October. Snow's going to settle on that rail, and it'll pull the post before January." "Probably." Thomas took another piece of cornbread. "We should get to it before it gets worse." "Do we settle between them?" Gideon, "Let it settle." Cora, from the stove, "Let it settle." Outside the snow came down, and the world reduced itself to what could be seen from the windows, and inside the fire was going and supper was coming, and the particular interior warmth of a house in a storm gathered itself around all 5 of them without any of them having decided on it. If you're still with us on this porch, do this story a kindness. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell. These quiet stories don't get told if you don't share them. Tag someone who loves a true frontier story in the comments. Let them know we're telling these the way they deserve to be told. There was a woman in town named Clara Speer, the wife of the man who ran the Calder's Fork Dry Goods, who had taken it upon herself to be concerned about the moral situation at the Warr property. Clara Speer was not cruel in the way that some people are cruel from pleasure in it. She was concerned in the way that some people are concerned when something in their community falls outside the arrangement they have decided is correct, and she expressed her concern with the particular energy of someone who believes they are acting from virtue. She came to call on a Thursday in mid-November, which Gideon considered bold given the state of the road. He was not home. He was checking the east fence line. "Cora, answer the door." Clara Speer was a trim woman of 50 with a good coat and an expression that had settled into its current configuration some years ago and was unlikely to shift much before the grave. She looked at Cora on the doorstep with a measuring gaze that Cora received without expression. "Mrs. Blaine," Clara said, "I'm Clara Speer. I've been meaning to come and speak with you." "Come in," Cora said. Clara came in, looked at the room, at the children, Nell studying her composition book, Bess arranging a set of small wooden shapes that Gideon had made for her from the scrap pile, Thomas absent, and formed her expression into something she intended to convey both warmth and concern. "It's quite cozy," she said. "It's comfortable," Cora agreed. "Sit down." Clara sat. She clasped her hands in her lap. "I want to speak with you woman to woman," she said, "about your situation." "All right. People in town are talking." Clara paused, apparently waiting for some reaction. Cora offered none. A widow woman living in a single man's house. It reflects badly on you and on him, whatever the actual circumstances. "The actual circumstances," Cora said, "are that I'm the cook and housekeeper. Mr. Warr supplies the house and the food. My children have a roof. Of course. But appearances, Mrs. Speer." Cora folded her hands on the table, an echo of Clara's own posture that was not accidental. "I have 3 children. I have $10, which is what remained after the wagon passage and 2 nights in Sheridan. I arrived in Calder's Fork to find the job I'd been told about no longer existed. Mr. Warr offered me work in a room." She paused. "I understand that people are talking. People have been talking about women in my situation since the first woman found herself in my situation. The talking has never once put food on a table or a blanket over a child." Clara Speer blinked. Something shifted in her face, less of the set look and more of what was underneath it, which was, Gideon would later think when Cora described the visit, probably where the actual person lived. "I don't mean to be unkind," Clara said, and for the first time sounded like she actually meant it. "I know," Cora said. "You mean to help. I understand that." She held the woman's gaze. "If you want to help, the boy needs boots. His have split at the sole, and I've been padding them with cloth, but it's not holding. He won't say anything about it. He's 7 years old, and he won't say a word about cold feet because he's trying not to be a burden, and I can't make him stop trying not to be a burden, but I can get him better boots if someone will point me toward where they might be had at a fair price." Clara Speer was quiet for a moment. She looked at Bess, who was arranging her wooden shapes into a careful row along the windowsill the way she arranged everything, precisely and deliberately, finding order in small things. "What size?" Clara asked. They had Thomas's boots resold at the cobblers in town before the week was out. Clara Speer organized it and paid half the cost herself, which she did not announce to anyone except her husband, who was used to her and said nothing beyond telling her she'd done right. The town's talking did not stop, but it shifted register, the way conversation shifts when someone puts a fact in the room that won't fit neatly into the story that was already being told. December arrived, and with it the cold that Gideon had described to Cora in the first week, the kind that arrived at elevation as a settled fact rather than a condition, the kind that did not lift in the middle of the day the way late autumn cold did but simply stayed. He had been preparing for it since October. The woodpile under the eaves was double what a single man required. The root cellar was full. The barn was chinked, and the mule had enough hay to last through March. What he had not prepared for, because it was not a thing he had needed to prepare for in 11 years, was the quality of a house in winter with people in it. The house was warmer, not just from body heat, though that was part of it. It was the bread in the mornings and the soup that always had something new in it that he could not always identify, and the sound of the children at their lessons at the table in the afternoon. Cora taught them herself, an hour of reading and an hour of numbers, with an authority that suggested she had been doing this for years and had not stopped simply because the circumstances had changed. It was Bess's wooden shapes on the windowsill, which moved around daily in configurations that Gideon was beginning to think meant something specific to the child, though he had not yet figured out the system. It was Thomas, who had taken over feeding Clary in the mornings without being asked, and did it before anyone else was up, which Gideon discovered only because he rose before dawn himself. He did not say anything to Thomas about this. He simply found, on those mornings when he went to the barn, that the mule had been fed and the water bucket broken from ice and the hay freshened. He let the evidence speak and did not comment. One evening, maybe 2 weeks into December, he found Cora at the table after the children were in bed with a piece of paper in front of her and a pencil in her hand. She was not writing. She was looking at what she had written, which appeared from across the room to be a list of some kind, and her expression was the one she had when she was doing arithmetic in her head and was not satisfied with the numbers. "What's that?" he asked. She handed it to him. It was a list of possible work in the area, noting next to each entry what she had been able to find out about the likelihood of it coming to anything. Most of the entries had been crossed out. At the bottom, she had written, in April, hotel, and left it standing. "You're planning for spring?" he said. "I'm trying to." She took the paper back. "The hotel in town takes on laundress work in spring when the trail traffic picks up. Mrs. Garnett, who runs it, is not a warm woman, but she pays fairly, and she doesn't care much about people's history." Cora folded the paper. "But I need to have somewhere to live when I take the work, because I can't take the children to a working boarding house situation. And there's nothing in town that's the right price." "There's nothing in town at all," Gideon said. "I know." He sat down across from her. The lamp was between them, and the stove was going behind him, and outside the wind was doing what December wind does at this elevation, which is say things clearly whether you want to hear them or not. "You're trying to have a plan." "I'm always trying to have a plan." Something in her voice was dry and a little tired. "It's harder than it used to be, because—" She looked at the folded paper. "Because making plans when there are 3 children, depending on the plan, is different from making plans when it's only yourself. When it was only me, being wrong about a plan was inconvenient. Now it's—" She stopped. "Now it costs them," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the wind. Inside the stove, the lamp, the silence between 2 people who had been in close quarters long enough that silence had stopped requiring filling. "The children don't want to leave," he said. It was not an argument. It was just a fact he was putting on the table. "I know. Thomas checked the south fence post this morning. He's been watching it all week." "I know." He looked at her. She was looking at the lamp with an expression that was very controlled and very tired. "Cora." She looked up. He had thought about how to say what he wanted to say, and he had come to the conclusion, which was his usual conclusion about difficult things, that the direct route was the only honest one. "I'm not trying to complicate your planning," he said, "but there's a piece of it you may not have fully put in the count." "What piece?" "This house is better with you in it." He said it plainly, the way he said everything, not with decoration or apology. "Not only because of the cooking, though the cooking is excellent, because of what you've done to the boy and to the little one, because I know what it sounds like when a child who has stopped talking starts again, and I've been listening to Bess since the first week." He held her gaze. "And because I have been living alone for 11 years, and I had, until about 6 weeks ago, convinced myself that I preferred it." She was very still. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight," he said. "I'm asking you to not decide either, before you have a plan with an April date on it." He pushed back from the table. "Think about it." He went to bed and left her with the lamp. He could not have said what he expected from that conversation. He was 51 years old and had long since trained himself away from expecting specific outcomes from things, because that way lay the particular disappointment of a person who had forgotten that other people were not required to want what you wanted. He went to sleep and woke before dawn and went to the barn and found, as he had been finding for weeks now, that Thomas had already fed the mule. He stood in the barn in the cold and looked at the fed mule and the freshened hay and the ice already broken from the water bucket, and he thought about a 7-year-old boy who rose before dawn in the cold to take care of an animal that was not his because he had decided, without anyone asking him to, that it was his responsibility. He thought about what it cost a child to love something, after loss, when they didn't yet know whether the thing they were loving would stay. The conversation he had been waiting for came not from Cora, but from Nell. It was a Sunday afternoon, and he was mending a piece of tack at the table, and Nell had stayed inside while the others went to check on something Thomas had found in the root cellar, a family of mice, as it turned out, which resolved itself without drama. Nell sat across from him with her composition book open and looked at him with her mother's eyes and said, without preamble, "Are you going to ask my mother to stay?" He set down the tack. That's not the kind of question children usually ask strangers. You're not a stranger anymore. He looked at her. She had Cora's way of saying things plainly, which he had come to recognize as a family characteristic. No, he agreed. I'm not. She worries, Nell said. She thinks she's hiding it, but she wakes up in the night, and I can hear her thinking. It sounds like thinking. She looked at her composition book. She used to do it after Papa died. Then she stopped for a while. Now she's doing it again. He was quiet for a moment. What do you think she's thinking about? What comes next? Nell turned a page. She always worries about what comes next. Before, Papa was what came next. He always knew where we were going even when we weren't sure we could get there. She smoothed the page with her hand. She doesn't have that anymore. She's managing well. She's managing. Nell looked up. That's not the same as having what comes next. He picked up the tack again, but didn't resume mending. He sat with it in his hands and thought about what the girl had just said and about Cora's folded paper with the April date on it. Do you want to stay? He asked. Nell was quiet for a moment. Then, Thomas talks again. Bess talks again. I don't have to listen so hard all the time to make sure they're all right. She smoothed the page again. So yes, I want to stay. He put down the tack. He found Cora at the wood pile, where she had been splitting kindling with more efficiency than he expected, and stood beside her until she set the axe down and looked at him. I need to say something clearly, he said, because I didn't say it clearly enough before, and you deserve clarity. She waited. I'm asking you to stay. He held her gaze in the cold December afternoon with the snow on the ground and the mountains above them going white and the sound of the children somewhere behind the barn doing something that involved Thomas, saying something emphatic and Bess laughing, which was still new enough to stop everything when it happened. Permanently. You and the children. As my wife, if you're willing. Not as the cook. Not as an arrangement through winter. He paused. As the reason I set 4 plates. She was looking at him with those steady dark eyes. He had no idea what she was going to say, and he was old enough and honest enough to know that not knowing was the right condition, that a woman who had buried her husband and moved her children across uncertain country and knocked at a stranger's door and done everything that came after with the grace and the backbone he had been watching for 6 weeks was not required to say yes to anything she hadn't decided for herself. You set 4 plates before you knew anything about us, she said. I set 4 plates because there were 4 people and I had 4 plates, he said. It wasn't complicated. She looked at him for a long moment. Behind the barn, Bess laughed again. The sound was round and clear and carried through the cold air with the particular quality of sounds that carry well when everything else is quiet. Yes, she said. He had not expected it to be that simple, and then he had. She was not a person who said things she didn't mean, and she was not a person who waited past the moment of certainty. He had watched her long enough to know that. The children, he said. Thomas will need to come to it in his own time. He'll want to think of it as his decision. She picked up the axe and set it against the woodpile. Give him a week and he'll make it his decision. And Nell figured it out before either of us did. He almost smiled. She turned and walked back toward the house, and he stood for a moment beside the woodpile in the cold with the mountains above and the sky going gray at the edges the way it did at this hour, and felt something settle in his chest that had been in motion for a very long time. Inside the house, Bess was at the windowsill with her wooden shapes, arranging them into a new configuration. He stood in the doorway and looked at what she was making. It was a row of 5 shapes, all facing the same direction, evenly spaced. What is that? He asked. She considered the question for a moment. Then she said, us. He stood in the doorway a moment longer. Then he went to the scrap pile in the corner and found the piece of walnut he had been saving without knowing what for, and he brought it to the table and sat down and took out his knife. A bird needed more wood, he had told her. This piece was wide enough. He began to carve, and Bess came to stand at his elbow, and outside the first real dark of the December evening settled over the mountains and over the yard and over the wood pile and over everything that had, without anyone planning it, become theirs. The wedding was in February at the church in town, with Pastor Hecht officiating and a small group of witnesses that included Pete Munn and his wife, the Halverson family who came to spite the road, and Clara Speer, who sat in the second row and did not say a word about appearances except to tell Cora, afterward in the churchyard, that the coat she was wearing was a good color on her. Thomas stood beside Gideon during the ceremony with his jaw set and his eyes serious and his hand in his pocket around the small piece of iron that Gideon had given him 3 weeks before, a proper farrier's rasp, bought new from the supply in Sheridan, and shook hands with 2 men and the pastor after the ceremony in a way that made it clear he had decided this was his occasion and was going to handle it accordingly. Nell held Bess's hand during the words. Bess watched everything with her grave attention, and afterward asked Clara Speer what the flowers on her hat were made of, which was the most words she had directed at a stranger since October, and Clara told her they were silk and let her touch one. On the ride home, all 5 of them in the wagon with the mountains going orange in the last of the afternoon light, Thomas said, out of nowhere, to no one specifically, the south fence post held. It did, Gideon said. The snow packed different than I thought. It went around the post instead of settling on the rail. Ground was still soft enough underneath to give a little. Takes the pressure off. Thomas thought about this. So it doesn't always go the way you figure it will. Rarely exactly. Another pause. The wagon moved. Bess had fallen asleep against Cora's arm. Nell was looking at the mountains. That's good to know, Thomas said, and did not say anything else, but settled back with an expression that meant he was filing this away somewhere he would take it out later and examine it when no one was watching. They came up the road to the house in the last light, the cabin sitting against the granite cliff the way it had always sat, the wood pile stacked under the eaves, the smoke already rising because Nell had asked to run ahead and start the stove. The lamp was lit in the kitchen window. Cora looked at the lit window from the wagon. The bird came out well, she said. He had finished it in January and given it to Bess, a small walnut owl with its wings close to its sides and its head tilted at the particular angle of a bird considering something. Bess had put it on the windowsill at the center of her row of shapes, and it had not moved since. It's a fair piece, he said. She looked at him. He helped her down from the wagon, and she went up the porch steps, and at the door she stopped for a moment with her hand on the latch and looked back at the yard, at Thomas unhitching the mule with the practiced ease of a boy who had decided an animal was his to care for, and Nell's light in the window, at Gideon coming up the steps behind her. She did not say anything. She opened the door and went in, and the warmth of the stove came out to meet them, and the smell of something Nell had put on a heat, because she had paid attention to how long these things took, and the lit lamp on the table throwing its circle of light across the plank floor, and across Bess's row of shapes on the windowsill, the owl at the center of them all, watching the room with its carved, tilted attention. Cora hung her coat on the peg beside his. She had knocked at this door in October with $10 and 3 children, and the particular kind of courage that does not announce itself, the kind that simply keeps moving because stopping is not permitted. She had not asked to be saved. She had asked to work, and she had worked, and in the working had built something that no one had planned and everyone had needed, and that was hers now, every plank and peg and frozen-over creek path and stubborn mule of it. She went to the stove and took over from Nell, who handed off the wooden spoon and went to find her composition book with the relief of a child returning to something that was hers to do. Outside, Thomas's voice came through the barn wall, low and companionable, talking to the mule the way he always talked when he thought no one could hear. Gideon sat down at the table. Bess climbed into the chair across from him and pushed her wooden shapes to one side to make room for the table setting she was apparently about to arrange. She picked up a spoon and set it down with precision. 5 places, she said. That's right, he said. She set out 5 of everything, moving around the table with the seriousness she brought to all arrangements, and Cora stood at the stove and supper came on and the mountains went fully dark outside, and the lamp held its circle steady. And that was the whole of it, and it was more than enough. Thank you for staying until the last word. If this story moved you, the next one is already up on your screen. Go give it a watch. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and join the porch. We're telling stories about women who carried more than the world ever knew. See you in the next one.